The only thing I'd say about my current career is that, and this is where this comes from, is I'm currently Vice President of the ACT branch of the Military Historical Society of Australia. So I do a hell of a lot of military history these days, but I try and link as much of it as I can to ships, which is where this came from. Now, as you see, the Type 21 U-boat, the true story as against the mythological story. I should at this point say that this is an abbreviated presentation. The full one goes about another 30 minutes longer than this one. But if anybody wants a copy of the full presentation, I guess they could probably just send me an email, or maybe we'll work something out with Lily. But this is the abbreviated version. I probably left out a lot of analysis and just given you the answers in some places. Let's see how this works. There we go. So this is sort of the setting the scene. So there's the Collins class in the bottom right-hand corner. Now the Oberon class is the father of the Collins class, and the Type 21 U-boat is the grandfather of the Collins class. And thanks to the good offices of Martin Reynoldson, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner a model of a Type 21 next to a model of the Collins class to the same scale. So it's a pretty big U-boat. Now, the Type 21 U-boat was the first submarine designed to operate submerged at all times, so it's the first true submarine. All other things before that were basically diving boats. Here's the history starting. I hope you all know that on the 22nd of May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was won. And in fact, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief German Navy, conceded that by declaring Wolfpack operations against the convoys in the North Atlantic are done and dusted. We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. And this is where it leads into the talk, because he also went on to say, only a U-boat which no longer needed to surface in order to charge its batteries, which had both high speed and long endurance underwater, could improve our prospects in the battle ahead. But he says, our sole consolation that such a boat already existed, and that each hour brought us nearer to the day when it would enter the fight. It's obviously what we're going to be talking about. So we're talking about the development of Wonder-submarines, as they were called during World War II. And we've got a dog barking. And Dönitz was placing high hopes on a thing called the Walter program. The brilliant German submarine designer, Professor Walter, had come up with the answer before the war, which was boats that could operate permanently underwater using hydrogen peroxide as the fuel. Well, actually as the oxidizer for the fuel, so that they would, if you're a chemist, use potassium permanganate as a catalyst to generate oxygen from hydrogen peroxide, burn diesel fuel and run it through a turbine. Now, he demonstrated a prototype V8 submarine, V80 submarine, relatively small, to Grand Admiral Raeder, who was the Commander-in-Chief at the time, at Hella on the 14th of November 1941. However, the Naval High Command did not allocate any resources to the development of this new technology. And this is possibly due to the fact that Hitler had issued a directive in 1940 cancelling all experimental work on systems that couldn't be in service by 1941 when he expected to have won. Mind you, Churchill did the same thing in Britain and cancelled a whole bunch of Navy projects because they weren't going to be delivered by 1944. However, Dönitz didn't give up, and on the 24th of June 1942, he pressed Raeder, his commander, for the new Walter designed boats. The letter ending, the immediate development, testing and most rapid construction of the Walter U-boat is, in my opinion, an essential measure and one which will decide the whole issue of the war. However, his pleas rejected. Dönitz didn't give up. He took matters into his own hands. He had a bit of a conference. He summoned his senior engineer officer, Papa Tedson, and two leading U-boat designers, naval architects, Klaus Breuking and Friedrich Schurer, and Professor Walter, to a meeting in his headquarters in August, and then raised the matter directly with Hitler at the Naval Conference in Berlin on the 28th of September 1942. And this was the genesis of the Type 18 U-boat, which is not the one we're talking about, well, we'll get there. And Hitler was swayed and approved the mass production of the new boats as soon as the designs were ready. And he at last accepted that the submarine plays a decisive role in the outcome of this war. He was a bit land-centric, Hitler. And on the 10th of October 1942, so it's all rapidly happening, Walter presented the specification what was now designated the Type 18 U-boat, specified as a Walter twin-screw design, two 6,000 horsepower turbines, introducing exhaust gas compression, 26.8 knots underwater. Wow. And in November 1942, Walter presented the basic design of the Type 18 to Dönitz, Breuking, Speer and Vass, another naval constructor, in Paris. Nice place to meet. And there it is. Designed for continuous submerged patrol. It's been highly streamlined. Everything's been removed that increased resistance. The deck gun's gone, stanchions, everything else. The ability to operate on the surface is basically gone. Reduced resistance for submerged operations. Very modern looking boat. Wouldn't look out of place today. Unfortunately, isn't reality a terrible thing? Breking and Vast made the immediate point that the engine installation wasn't yet ready. And even Walter, who was usually overly optimistic, hesitated on this point. This meant that the delay in series production of at least a year was unavoidable. Now, work did continue on the Type 18 for the rest of the war, but none of them was ever completed. Dönitz, to say the least, was deeply disappointed. However, Broking and Speer are clever boys, and in January 1943, they proposed using the streamlined hull designed for the Type 18 and giving it, instead of hydrogen peroxide engines, boosted conventional battery-powered propulsion. And they reckoned they could get 19 knots underwater and the ability to remain submerged for up to 60 hours. This was good news to Dönitz, and design work on the new boats was set in motion in May 1943. Now, not only did they design the Type 21, which we're going to talk about, which is a big boat, but they also designed a smaller Type 23 coastal submarine as well. Now, the plans for these new boats offered Dönitz the heady prospect of regaining the initiative at sea. They'd be safe from aircraft because they were always going to be underwater. They could outrun almost every escort that the Allies used at that time. Those of you that are there might not realise it, but you can't use ASDIC or sonar above 20 knots in the Second World War. So fast ships like destroyers were not much help. And in addition, the Type 21 would be able to dive to 1,000 feet, well beyond the range of current depth charges, as the Germans thought. And they were going to install a new hydraulic system for loading the torpedoes, which basically made it sort of semi-automatic loading of the torpedoes instead of the man-handling that they had been doing. There it is. As you can see, if this will work for me. The same hull as the Type 18, highly streamlined. What we've now got is a big battery compartment, big diesel engines, and big electric motors. But still a very, very modern looking submarine. And that's the highly publicised specification and performance figures for the Type 21 that you can find just about everywhere, which we won't look at in a great deal of detail now because we will be looking at it in a great deal of detail later, but it's all pretty impressive stuff, as you can see there. Now it's down to practicalities coming into play. Top speed of 17.2 knots underwater, which, if my memory serves me correctly, was about the top speed of an Oberon class. So it's pretty advanced stuff, this Type 21. Got to build it. And the whole program seemed doomed almost immediately, because when the Naval High Command construction experts estimated the new fleet would not be ready before 1946 if conventional construction methods were used, Dönitz is not pleased. But he uses his new relationship with Hitler. I'll probably interject slightly here. Do you all remember that Dönitz succeeded Hitler as being the Führer of Germany? He was Hitler's designated replacement. But in his new replacement, he got skilled shipyard workers exempt from being conscripted to the army, amongst other things. And he got an increase in the steel allocation for the Navy. And indeed, in April, he went further and sought Hitler's permission for a new naval construction program centred on the Type 21, requiring an extra 30,000 tonnes of steel a month. Now, to carry out the new task, Dönitz came to an understanding with Albert Speer, an architect, not a naval architect, but nonetheless. He was the armaments minister. He got on well with Dönitz and welcomed his proposal that his ministry should take over naval construction. Very powerful organisation, but even then, the best initial estimates for an accelerated development program foresaw the arrival of the first boats in late 1944 and series production not beginning until March 1945. Still not good enough. A radical proposal. Speer resolved to break the conservative engineering and construction culture of the established dockyards with a radical program of modular construction and dispersed serialized component manufacturing. We may be doing that in the new submarines. And in July 1933, he appointed Otto Merker, an impetuous 40-year-old industrial engineer with experience in automobiles and fire engine manufacturing, to head the main committee for ship construction. Now, Merker proposed a new class of U-boats be assembled from 8 large prefabricated sections weighing between 70 and 130 tonnes apiece. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Assembled by inland firms that up till then had just been making bits of the pressure hulls. The prefabricated sections would be transported by barge on inland waterways to 3 final assembly points: Blum und Voss in Hamburg, which I visited many times, Deschimag in Bremen, and Schickau in Elbe, east of Danzig, which is now in Poland, I'm pretty certain. Now, utilising such methods, Merker claimed the first Type 21 could be launched by the 1st of April 1944. Now, there's an improvement, with production rising to 30 boats per month by the autumn of that year. And in fact, the first Type 21 was launched less than 3 weeks later, on the 19th of April 1944, which is a significant date because they wanted to launch it before Adolf Hitler's birthday, which is on the 20th. As it turned out, the launch was a fake. I don't know whether you know this, but it's a bit similar to the keel laying ceremonies for Collins-class submarines, which were a fake. They just rolled out the same section every time. The reason it was a fake was they strapped a whole bunch of buoyancy tanks onto the side of it, launched it into the water, and then the next day they hauled it back out of the water and got back onto building it. But nonetheless, it's not a bad effort. And there you go. There's a section arriving with another section. Now, I think people building submarines today would be very familiar with a photograph like that. That looks pretty modern, doesn't it? It's all very advanced stuff. Now, has anybody seen this program? I can't really ask, can I? But Nazi Megastructures, Hitler's Killer Subs, did an entire episode on the Type 21 U-boat. Hosted by James Holland, historian, writer and broadcaster, and his able assistant was Dr. Nick Bradby, a naval architect, Research Association, University College London. And they said all sorts of good things about the Type 21. The one weapon that could have been a real game changer. There was no technology that could find and destroy it. Although she is much bigger than a Type 7, amazingly, the streamlined hull produces a smaller acoustic signature, making it harder for the enemy sonar to detect her. The Type 21 is quieter and deeper diving than any submarine that's come before. 5,000 horsepower, drives the propellers enough to achieve 17 knots, which is 2.5 times faster than the Type 7. 236 tonnes of batteries, enough to power the boat for 11 days. It's a big step forward to allow the Type 21 to fight underwater. Type 21's 2 diesel engines can recharge the batteries in just 5 hours. The Type 21's snorkel, we'll talk about snorkels in a minute, is ingenious. It means that unlike the Type 7, the Type 21's engines can remain running underwater even in the roughest seas. And this advanced automatic reloading system, it can reload all 6 of its torpedo tubes in less time than a Type 7 could have reloaded a single tube. And it carried 20 torpedoes, 6 in the tubes and another 14 in the torpedo room behind it. So there's the potential for firing and hitting, if you're lucky, 18 ships inside 20 minutes. There was also something they didn't mention that U-boataces.com did mention, which it was equipped, first time ever on a German U-boat, and I think probably any submarine by that stage, a sophisticated echo chamber. It was actually a sonar system which could identify, track and target multiple vessels, allowing the Type 21 to blind fire from depths up to 160 feet. So it's a pretty cool item, the old Type 21. Wonder-submarine. So on the 28th of January 1945, Dönitz assured Hitler that against the revolutionary qualities of the new types of U-boat, Types 21 and 23, the mighty sea power of the Anglo-Saxons is essentially powerless. The bad news probably is at the bottom of the stream, but despite the first Type 21, U-2511, having been commissioned on 27th June 1944, no Type 21 U-boat had yet gone on an operational patrol. And indeed, at the start of 1945, there were 90 Type 21s in service, but none were operational. So reality is beginning to sneak in a bit. And there's the first one, U-2511, commissioned 27th June 1944, not a bad effort. from Mr. Merker. There she is, heading out on patrol. She was the first Type 21 to go on patrol, and indeed the only one. And that's the 3rd of May 1945. Left Bergen under the command of Corvetting Captain Adalbert Schnee. Now on the 4th of May, she encountered a hunting group north of the Faroe Islands. When Schnee was picked up on a corvette's Asdic in the North Sea, the submerged submarine raced away from the enemy at 16 knots, a speed he was able to maintain for over an hour, leaving a fading Asdic echo on the baffled corvette captain's screen. But at 0300 on the 5th of May, U-2511 received Admiral Dernitz's return to base order. The war was over. By this stage, Dernitz is head of state. However, on the way back, Schnee in 2511 encountered the British heavy cruiser Norfolk and a screen of several destroyers in the early hours of 5th May 1945. He delivered a dummy underwater attack, penetrated the destroyer screen without being detected, and came within 500 yards of the Norfolk. So he's sitting there watching the big ship. He's not quite certain what to do. He prepares to release a salvo of torpedoes, but at the last minute changes his mind because he's been sold the war's over. Torpedoes are never fired, and the 2511 turns for home. That's where they were. So you can see, if I can do this properly, that's where he evaded the corvette to the north of the Faroes. This is Norfolk coming down, and that's where the meeting occurred. Later events showed the British had no idea how near to destruction a cruiser had been, and Schnee judged the Type 21 to be first class in attack and defence, something completely new to any submariner. Historians and broadcasters, including the producers of Nazi Megastructures, Hitler's killer subs, who told us the story, cite this as evidence that the Type 21 U-boat was the one weapon that could have been a real game changer, and there was no technology that could find and destroy it. And indeed, you'll find this story everywhere in books and on the internet, and I do mean everywhere. Except, did it actually happen? Because Schnee's account is not consistent with known facts. He claimed his U-boat departed Bergen on the 30th of April 1945, but the correct date's actually the 3rd of May. And he says, there are bits in red from his description of what happened. In the periscope, I saw an English cruiser of the Suffolk class escorted by multiple destroyers, except that Norfolk had no destroyers with her that day. So he didn't penetrate a destroyer screen. We then reappeared in front of Bergen on May 5th and ran on. In the harbour, to our surprise, was the English cruiser. Now, the submarine didn't return to Bergen until the next day, and Norfolk was in fact at sea to the northwest of the Shetland Islands bound for Scapa Flow. And the cruiser did go to Bergen, but not earlier than the 15th of May and possibly as late as 30th of May. He then claimed he was taken on board Norfolk for interrogation straight away, but his U-boat didn't surrender until the 9th of May, and there's no record of any interrogation of Schnee on board Norfolk in existence anywhere. It's all a bit dodgy, which comes from the fact that Schnee's track record with regard to his accounts of his sinkings makes him an unreliable witness. In fact, he overclaimed by 100% when he was claiming his victories. We do have another witness, the former second engineering officer of U-2511, Heinrich Knappmann. Now, there was a witness, an eyewitness, Wolfgang Frank, who actually wrote up the story of the dummy attack in a book, Die Wolf und der Admiral, where he narrates events during the simulated attack in detail as if he was present on board himself. But Knappmann confirms that, in fact, Frank wasn't on board U-2511 on that patrol. On the other hand, Knappmann does state that the simulated attack did happen, although he's an engineer officer and would have been in the engine room and not looking through the periscope, so we don't know. And he did confirm that Norfolk was not at Bergen when the 2511 returned from its last patrol. So it's all very confusing. And then this guy appeared, Dr. Axel Nestle, who in 1998 thought it might be a good idea if someone actually worked out if the U-2511 and HMS Norfolk could possibly have been in the same location at the same time. Nestle got hold of the copy of Norfolk's log, which is to the right there. You can't read it, but I've read it for you. He reviewed Schnee's account of U-2511's last voyage, which we've seen bits of. The log for that voyage has never been found. He trawled through now declassified ultra decrypts and intelligence reports, and he found in the files this message, U-2511 bracket Snow. Snow is, of course, the English translation of Schnee. Left Bergen at 02:30 on the 3rd of May for first cruise. So we now know when she left. And he interviewed all surviving witnesses, crunched some numbers and came up with this, which is where everybody was at 0800 on the 5th of May. And as you can see, the two ships are not anywhere near each other. In fact, nor can U-2511 have made it to the Faroe Islands. So the encounter could not possibly have taken place. It's been 20 years since Nestle published his article, which I won't attempt to pronounce. It's in German, which is probably why not too many people have found it or read it, but I found it and read it. And according to the Deutsche U-boat Museum, no book or academic article has appeared in that time countering his arguments. And I have to say, I also got hold of a copy of Norfolk's log. I got hold of Schnee's account and I crunched the numbers. Possibly crunched more numbers than he did. And I've not been able to find any flaw in his analysis. So I've concluded that U-2511 did not evade a corvette on the 4th of May, nor carry out a simulated attack on HMS Norfolk on the 5th of May 1945. So it's a myth. So that's the end of Type 21 operations, because that's the only one that went out. So now, we need to look at the Type 21. We need to look at specifically, I guess, was the Type 21 U-boat the one weapon that could have been a real game changer, as James Holland claimed? In fact, can he make this claim? And there are all the claims that we saw earlier. I've jumbled them up a bit, just to be different. The question becomes, so why would it be that almost none of this is true? It's because reality rears its ugly head, and we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at reality. Isn't reality a bugger for naval architects? Anybody played around in a towing tank and tried to sort out Froude number with Reynolds number? It's awfully difficult. So the problem is that all of that's on the screen at the moment and was on the Nazi megastructures, all of that's assumption because no Type 21 ever operated. To make it worse, it's all assumption based on the assumption that all of that is true. And to start with, that's bollocks. Even the Germans thought that was 4 hours. I don't know where the 1 hour came from. And of course, it won't surprise you to know that they didn't think it could do 17.2 knots forever. It can only do that. They were anticipating it would be for about 90 minutes before the batteries were exhausted. But what we really need to do now is let's have a look at the Type 21 with some ugly reality glasses on. Ugly reality is a terrible thing. So, 5,000 horsepower drives the propellers enough to achieve 17 knots. One of the problems was the Type 21 was conceived originally as a diving boat. Therefore, it was necessary that diving time be as short as possible. They specified 20 seconds. To achieve this, they put a very large number of freeing ports. And that increased the drag when it was submerged by 28%, which meant that when a submerged measured mile run on the 8th of November by U-3506, a standard Type 21 only managed 15.93 knots. Now, the British had one Type 21 after the war to play with, and the Americans had two. And in the US trials after the war, they did get speeds above 16 knots in some tests. And indeed, U-2513 managed to get over 17 knots once. Mind you, in the following year, they never got either of them to go faster than 15 to 15.5 knots. And the British, after their testing, concluded there is reason to believe the top speed for 1 hour's duration would be much nearer 15 knots. And in fact, that tallies with German operational experience. Those acronyms, FDU, BDU, they stand for Submarine Command Headquarters, U-boat Command Headquarters. And in their war log on January 1945, they stated that the maximum underwater speed for a Type 21 was 15 knots. One of the reasons was testbed results for the large main motors. They got a maximum power of 1800 kilowatts, and they could maintain that for an hour. But normal boat practice, reality once again, was that each double motor only got 1650 kilowatts for 20 minutes, so maybe 16 knots for 20 minutes, and could maintain 1550 kilowatts for 50 minutes. So maybe 15 knots for 50 minutes was a realistic maximum speed. So now figures are starting to look like that, which is not quite so impressive. Now the diesel engines. This is shades of the Collins class as well, because to offset the weight of and make space available for the huge 372 cell battery, the Germans powered the Type 21s with two newly developed 6-cylinder lightweight diesels rated at nearly 2,000 horsepower, each with superchargers driven by the exhaust gases, which we'd probably call turbochargers. But the Americans found the diesel engines were a major weakness in the Type 21's design. In fact, on actual trials, the output was limited to 1,700 horsepower by excessive exhaust gas temperatures. Furthermore, the exhaust-driven supercharger, when used when snorkeling, proved hazardous and was subsequently removed. In fact, all of those three Type 21s that the British and the Americans had to test had the superchargers removed by the Germans. So the diesels without the supercharger were able to operate only with snorkel cams in, which I haven't been quite able to work out what that means, but I'll do the best I can. This limited the output to 850 horsepower because they still got excessive exhaust temperatures once they got pushed them too far. Now the snorkel cams prevented the engine stopping through reversal of the charging pressure caused by strong counter pressure, which I'm guessing is when the snorkel got covered by water. So we've got 850 horsepower, not 2,000, which means the maximum surface speed was about 12 knots. Furthermore, the British, in taking them out for a run, found that anything other than flat calm, the bridge flooded at speed. As a result, the bridge was almost untenable in heavy weather, and British experience with these ships was that it was necessary to batten down and run on the surface with the snorkel mast up. Mind you, they're a boat that's not supposed to be on the surface, so that doesn't really matter that much. And of course, we have way less power than we thought we had. So the Americans found, as it's necessary to furnish 1,200 horsepower for 4 hours to the generators for charging each of the two batteries at the normal charging rate, the time required for a full charge is excessive. In fact, they found that it took at least 6 hours to charge the batteries. So now we look like that. 6-hour charging time. Yeah, things not so good. The Type 21 snorkel is ingenious. It means that unlike the Type 7, the Type 21's engines can remain running underwater even in the roughest seas. And there's Nick Bradby. Can you see Nick Bradby's hand? He's pointing to the unique part that he's talking about, which is this thing right here. The problem is that's not unique. In fact, that feature was on all Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats fitted with a snorkel. There's a drawing of a Type 7 U-boat, and there, in that red circle, is the feature that Nick Bradby was pointing to. It's on every U-boat. I don't know why he thought it was unique. There were unique features, however, of the snorkel. The Type 21s had a telescoping snorkel mast, whereas the Type 9 and the Type 7 had a hinged one. And unfortunately, it never worked properly. Using the snorkel, 10.9 knots was obtained on trial, but eddy shedding from the mast and periscope caused such severe vibration that the usable speed was about 6 knots, which is actually the same as a Type 7 and a Type 9. And the float valve in the snorkel head, which is also unique, the British found to be highly unsatisfactory. So, not snorkeling at 10.9 knots, but snorkeling at 6 knots, which is important because I know, and I'll now tell you, so you'll know, convoys in the Atlantic went at either 7 knots or 9 knots. So at 10.9 knots, you're going faster than the convoys, and at 6 knots, you're going slower than the convoys. Now, the Americans found also that it couldn't actually stow 23 torpedoes because you needed to have 3 idle positions because you needed to withdraw torpedoes from the tubes for servicing, because they were carrying quite sophisticated torpedoes at this stage, including the Zorn-Koenig homing torpedo. So you could only actually carry 20 torpedoes. Now, we've got the real advance being the automatic reloading system. So you could fire, theoretically, 18 torpedoes in 20 minutes. But now the British found that if a Type 21 were carrying 14 reload torpedoes, 6 of them were actually accommodated in the automatic reloading system, which meant you couldn't use it until you'd moved those torpedoes. So really, you couldn't do quite that. You had to fairly laboriously reload the first 6 and then you were away. But nonetheless, it didn't really matter because there's not a potential for hitting 18 ships in 20 minutes anyway, because the Type 21's got 20 torpedoes and it's got 4 different sorts. It's got ordinary G7E torpedoes, which you can't blind fire. They're for targeting ships through the periscope. And it's carrying NATs, which are a homing torpedo. And it's carrying FATs and LUTs, which are spooky anti-convoy torpedoes, which we'll see in a minute. And you can't fire all of those in the same circumstances. I mean, to start with, you don't want to fire your homing torpedoes because you're saving those to defend you against escorts. And you can't fire the FATs and LUTs while you're around because they're a meandering torpedo that might hit you. So really you don't have any, there's no scenario where you can fire 18 torpedoes rapidly anyway. Now, the Type 21 is deeper diving than any submarine that's come before, which on paper it was. Safe diving depth of 135 metres, a test diving depth of 200 metres, and a crush depth of 330. However, the Germans discovered a design defect in the torpedo hatch structure during a test dive on that first boat, 2511, the 16th of March 1945. Now, the Germans did develop a fix for this, and they tested it on the 8th of May 1945, which is 2 days before the war ended. The British and the Americans found this defect while examining captured Type 21s after the war. So all of the ones that were in service had the defect. Consequently, operationally, they were restricted to a safe diving depth of 180 metres, which is only a tiny bit more than the standard Type 7 or Type 9, and a test diving depth of 160 metres. One of the reasons these defects are creeping in, of course, is that these U-boats were being built by slave labour, which probably wasn't overly cooperative. So, not looking too good. But this is now what the true data looks like. And as you can see, it's not quite so impressive and doesn't lead to quite the same capabilities. This is probably the only spot where you'll find this true data, but there it is. Now, here's another one. There's no technology that can find and destroy it. Although she is much bigger than a Type 7, amazingly, the streamlined hull produces a smaller acoustic signature, making it harder for the enemy sonar to detect it. Now, the problem is today, modern submarines find other submarines using passive sonar. But in World War II, that was bollocks. Because, well, actually, so why is this bollocks? In the Second World War, surface vessels did not locate and attack submarines by listening for them. The primary method was active ASDIC sonar or pinging. So being quiet didn't help you. Worse, this large U-boat presented a strong ASDIC target. As it turned out, because it's twice the size, it's twice the target. Physics can't be denied. And even though it was quiet, which is an advantage, you get things like, even at 8 or 9 knots, the Type 21 was no noisier than a Type 7 at 3 or 4 knots. But of course, if you turn that round the other way, that means that if you're doing 8 or 9 knots in a Type 21, you are as noisy as a Type 7 at 3 or 4 knots. Now, that says see British fast submarine trolls and the hydrophone effect HE. That's one of the things I've left out of this presentation, but is in the full one. So the British were starting to experiment with using hydrophone effect, in other words, listening for U-boats, and we're making some advances on it. And also, sonar buoys were already operational in the Second World War. The batteries, 236 tonnes, enough to power the boat for 11 days. These are the actual numbers, which I've extracted from various reports. It's still pretty good, but you're not going 11 days, less than 7 days. And as you can see, the faster you go, the more rapidly you use up your electricity. So in other words, if you did 10 knots, you can go for about 10 hours. Do 8 knots for about 20 hours, do 6 knots for about 50 hours. And 3 knots is the minimum you can go to maintain depth control. Gets worse though, reality again. The British were conducting a trial on their boat that they had, which was the U-3017 in August 1945, when she suffered a battery explosion. It's not good in a submarine. Caused extensive damage and put her out of commission. Now, the Board of Inquiry found the accident was due to the abandonment of British procedures in favour of those used by the Germans. The board suggested the German practices had caused a number of battery explosions in other Type 21s and possibly led to their loss. In fact, there were rumours from the interrogation of U-boat officers about this, and an experienced German engineer officer recalled 4 battery explosions in Type 21s. Now, we shouldn't do this, should we? But the main electrical cables ran in the bilges under the battery compartment, and poor insulation and the presence of bilge water caused arcing. Now, when you're recharging the batteries, you exude hydrogen, which tends to explode when you have arcing near it. It's not a good thing. Now, the hydraulic system. And this fancy hydraulic system. And to conserve battery power for operations, which is a good thing, the Germans introduced a system of hydraulic power in place of the electrical motors on the Type 7 and 9, used to control periscope hoist, bow and stern blades, rudder, torpedo tube doors, the reloading system and other gear. The Germans lacked experience in hydraulics, however, on submarines. They produced a system that was much too complicated and much too delicate. And to make it worse, too many of the hydraulic lines and pistons were placed outside the pressure hull, where they could not be repaired when submerged and were highly vulnerable to depth charge explosions. Moreover, inasmuch as the external piping and fittings could not be made entirely leak-proof, seawater got in, constantly contaminated the system and diluted its power, and the boats left an oil trace. The Americans concluded the system as installed is over-engineered and unsuited to the type of vessel on which it is installed. And now the big one. The Type 21 U-boat was the one weapon that could have been a real game changer, which we're probably sceptical about now. So, could the Type 21 have made possible the return of wolf packs? Now, you don't know this, but I've researched it for you. Wolf pack operations required 2 key factors: speed. The U-boats and the wolf pack had to be able to move faster speed than the convoys to close with them. And the Type 21 could only do 6 knots snorkeling and 15 knots on the electric motors for only 50 minutes. So it didn't have the ability to close with the convoys. When they were operating earlier in the war, they stayed on the surface and they could go much faster than the convoys. But now they can't operate on the surface because the aircraft will sink them. And communications. Can't form up a wolf pack if you can't communicate by radio. The sighting U-boat had to report the convoy's location, course and speed by radio. And this information had to be sent to other U-boats in the wolf pack by radio. But operating at all times submerged, the Type 21 U-boat could not send or receive radio messages. So the Type 21 would not have made possible the return of the wolf packs. And this is concerned by the Germans themselves. This is the German statement of what they were planning to do. They'd planned to operate the Type 21s individually in ocean operations until their capabilities were fully understood. It became clear during the interrogations that the Germans had not developed a coherent concept of operation for the Type 21. The Germans were pressed on this. They wanted to use wolf pack tactics after the crews had gained experience. The intention was for pack tactics to be carried out submerged, which raised the tricky problem of communications, essential for a coordinated concentration of the pack and avoiding mutual interference. The Germans thought the difficulties would be overcome perhaps by the use of the new burst radio transmitter. That wasn't going to solve the problem because the burst radio transmitter just compressed messages. It didn't allow them to be transmitted underwater. So, how effective would it have been? Well, we don't know because no such operations were ever conducted. There is, however, a small amount of information to be found. As I said, there were 90 Type 21s in commission in January 1945. Now, in March 43, when they were almost winning the Battle of the Atlantic, they managed to maintain 12% of U-boats in commission in the operational areas. But by December 1944, they were only able to maintain 5% of U-boats in the operational areas. And that was because of longer transit times, because they had to remain submerged at all times, because if they didn't stay submerged, Allied aircraft sank them. Now, the Type 21 could make 110 miles per day transiting compared with 60 miles for a Type 7 or 9. That's transiting submerged. And so this might get the Type 21 back up to the 12% figure. But that would mean you've got only 12 to 15 Type 21s in the Atlantic operational area at any one time, whereas there were 50 Type 7 and 9s in March 43. So basically, interception of a convoy where you've only got 12 to 15 submarines out there is down to pure luck, and the probability would have been very low. Particularly since, if I work from memory, and this is in the full presentation, if you're looking at a periscope, the horizon's about 3 miles away. It's a big ocean, the Atlantic. Now, there was a German paper describing the methodology for a single Type XI U-boat attacking a convoy, presuming it's found one. Now, although the Type 21 had a much improved acoustic suite, greater emphasis was placed on the use of the periscope, which would inevitably restrict attacks largely to daylight hours. You might not all realise this, but the U-boats did all their attacking at night in the early parts of the war and on the surface. Now they were going to be attacking in the daylight looking through a periscope. Now, the recommended tactics was a submerged approach from the head of the convoy and forward of the beam, so coming in where that red arrow is. The screen would be penetrated at slow speed, either deeper at periscope depth, and then a salvo of 6 LUT torpedoes would be fired. That over to the right is what a LUT torpedo does. It's a torpedo that is programmed to weave through the convoy in the hope of maximising hitting a ship in one of the columns. It's not aimed. And I have to tell you that they used these LUT torpedoes from about the middle of 1943 to the end of the war, and they only sank 3 ships in the entire war with this torpedo. So the chances of it being very successful is not that high. Now, after firing, the Type 11 would dive under the convoy to reload. And indeed, it's got to proceed underneath the convoy at the convoy's speed, which is still relatively high for the Type 21. It's got to do possibly 9 knots to keep up with a 9-knot convoy. And it would use its 2 ASDIC sets that it's now got. Well, actually I shouldn't say ASDIC. The GHG, which is in the bow, that's a hydrophone. And that's a sonar for targeting. The idea being reload your torpedoes and fire blind from 160 feet. After firing the 3rd salvo, you then go deep, go slow, and let the convoy pass over the top of you. Now, just to do that, I've calculated that just sitting under the convoy at 9.5 knots, reloading your torpedo tubes and firing, is going to consume 15% of your U-boat's battery power. And indeed, the Germans estimated that this attack methodology might consume 80% of the battery power. And that's in line with my calculations. So you've only got 20% left when you've finished. However, at this stage of the war, I don't think too many U-boat captains would be doing that because they were justifiably fearful of the overwhelming anti-submarine resources available to the Allies, which was overwhelming. So in practice, it's unlikely any U-boat captain would conduct such an attack knowing they would have only 20% of his battery capacity left at the end when the escorts would be hunting him. Because pretty well, if you're down to 20%, your Type 21 U-boat's now just an ordinary U-boat. And this conclusion is supported by Eric Top. So who's he? There he is. Began his career in April 34. He commanded U-57, U-552, U-3010 and U-2513. The last 2 are Type 21 U-boats. Was the 5th highest scoring U-boat ace. Sank 35 ships, nearly 200,000 GRT, and a warship. By the looks of that size, a sloop or a frigate. Wrote the battle instructions for the Type 21 U-boat in 1944. And when the war ended, he was in command of a Type 21 U-2513, which surrendered in Norway, May 45. He retired as I think that's Vice Admiral, Eric Top, in the Wonder-submarine in December 1969. What did he say? Discretion is the better part of valour. Top thought that battery capacity ought to be maintained at a minimum level of 60 to 70% unless in an emergency. Now that's going to completely preclude that attack methodology because you're going to end up with 20%. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a copy of those battle instructions. They may be out there somewhere on the internet, but I couldn't find them. So we'll leave the last word on the Type 21 to this man, who was, as I said, the 5th highest scoring U-boat ace, wrote the battle instructions, commanded the 27th Training Flotilla base in Gottenhafen, which put him in charge of introducing new Type 21 U-boats into active service, And in August 44, he became Director of Testing and Training at Type 21 and Type 23 U-boats and commanded 2 Type 21 U-boats at the end of the war. He wrote in his autobiography with respect to the Type 21, the boats did by no means live up to the boasts that Dönitz had made to Hitler and us U-boat officers. Compared to the older Type 7C boats, the Type 21 version undoubtedly represented progress and innovation, but it could never by itself have turned the tide in the war at sea, let alone in the overall conflict. And that's your lot, except for questions.
Hand back to Warren.
Hand back to Warren.
Yeah, sorry, I was just a little slow getting to the mute and the video button. Thanks very much, Tim, for a wonderful presentation. And I guess in these times, in different scenarios, fact-checking is becoming a popular activity, particularly in the US at the moment on what Trump has to say. So the age of false news is not new, and what you've been able to do has been very, very interesting, I'm sure, as you made these discoveries. I guess, yeah, we open to questions, and I can see Martin raising his hand. So, Martin.
Thanks very much indeed, Tim. That was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed that. I'm looking forward to you doing the same on the Type 23. First of all, apology. I must have confused you in the email. Actually, that's a Type 214 sitting there next to the.
Okay.
One of the modern German ones. I apologise for that. I think I did send one without Collins in as well, but that's not it. So I apologise for that. I was interested in your comment that the drag was increased by 28% because of the additional holes, because of the quick diving. And of course, we know that a lot of extra holes, like spent holes, will increase the drag a lot. But 28% was an awful lot, of course. But how did you get that figure?
Well, I must admit, I didn't check it. I got that from some of the documents I found, and I couldn't quite interpret it. It could have meant, because it was in German, it could have meant that they contributed 28% of the drag, or it could have meant that they increased the drag, and I'm not quite sure what that means. I can tell you that they did substantially reduce the number of freeing ports as an experiment, and it did have a significant effect and did allow them to get a bit faster. But I can't exactly
that is quite a large component of the drag on a submarine. You're dead right. I just wondered how you got the particular number, because that's a component that's particularly difficult to estimate.
Yes, I didn't do it. I got it out of a book on Type 21 U-boats, which was in German. So I can't entirely swear at my translation.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I better get out, let somebody else jump in.
Thanks, Martin. Perhaps if I can ask people to queue a question, or just sort of list your name in the chat associated with the meeting if you have a question, because I can't see everyone at once raising a hand like Martin did. But do we have some other questions? Well, while people are thinking, what was it, Tim, that prompted you?
Martin's back.
Can I just shut up because I was sure somebody else would want to ask a question, but still didn't quite understand what you said. There was 90 Type 21s in January 45, but am I right in saying you said that they didn't sink any ships at all?
No, the U-2511 was the only one that went out on a patrol, and that lasted for 2 days.
Yeah, you said that, and it pretended to have shot at one, but it didn't shoot. So with all these 90 types in existence, there wasn't any other sort of patrol or any other.
No, they had continual difficulties. They were trying to sort out the problems. They were trying to train the crews. You got to remember that the shipyards were being bombed every day. I mean, this is probably a strange example, but I'll give it. There's a guy who was probably the unluckiest U-boat captain. When I read about it, I went, how did this guy manage to lose 2 Type 21 U-boats on consecutive days? And I thought, that can't be right. And I checked, and he did. He took one out of the shipyard, down the river to the ocean, got attacked by aircraft in the river, couldn't submerge, sunk. Raced back to the shipyard the next day, got another Type 21 U-boat, took it down the river, got bombed, sunk. So he lost 2 U-boats in consecutive days. That's
The
what
Germans
they were.
didn't let him have another one after that.
I'm not sure they did, but that's the thing they were up against. That they were being bombed and hassled, and they couldn't do their training. They couldn't get down the river to do training in the ocean because they got bombed. It was a nightmare.
And the other thing you mentioned is that you can't see very far with a periscope, which of course is very true. And I guess it's not saying too terribly much. You still, as you say, physics hasn't changed. It's still the same. But of course, the way you find where other ships are today is you listen for them. And you did say that the Type 21 had a good listening ability.
Yes, although I can give you an example that the hydrophones could give you a rough direction, but only probably plus or minus 20 degrees. And they couldn't give you a range at all. In fact, it was so bad that you're probably familiar with Gunter Preen, who got into Scapa Flow. He was in a U-boat and his hydrophones picked up what he thought was bombs being dropped on him. And they were actually bombs being dropped 100 miles away. Couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah, that hasn't changed. You still can't get the range from a passive sonar.
Yeah, so they couldn't really, and I thought surely they must have been using hydrophones to locate convoys, but they never did. It was just not reliable enough.
We have a question from Carl Linkenbach. He doesn't have a mic, so let me ask it on his behalf.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts on the Project 641, the USSR Foxtrot class, as a descendant from the Type 21?
It was definitely a descendant, because I mentioned that the Americans had 2 Type 21s and the British had 1. The Soviets also got Type 21 U-boats from the Germans, and they developed the Foxtrots from those Type 21s.
Excellent. And Martin's a good name, but Martin Grimm this time has a question.
Yeah, so Warren, loved that presentation. Look, one of the things that you said at the start was this whole issue about sort of like changing, I guess, effectively changing over production from the existing production line of submarines or putting more effort into these new ones. That, I think that is a problem that's sort of always existed in wars where, like, my memory is that, for instance, and this might be wrong, but the Spitfire was obviously a better performing fighter aircraft than the Hurricane, but the Hurricane was already in mass production. So, you know, and they were admittedly 2 different companies. But I guess my question is, what are your thoughts about, you know, stopping production of an existing run of submarines to try and put more effort into a newer, higher performing submarine when you've got a water fight?
Yeah, it certainly depends on the circumstances. I'll digress slightly. The Americans had the Sherman tank. They had better tanks than the Sherman tank. In fact, they had better models of the Sherman tank than the one they used in Europe, but they did exactly that. They thought, we can't interfere with this. The war's being fought. We will just go with the Sherman tanks we've got and we will build a lot of them. And they did build a lot of them. I mean, it's the same thing with the T-34 Russian tank. People think it's a good tank, but it wasn't that particularly good. But the Russians built 57,000 of them and lost 45,000 of them. That's the decision you make with that. But of course, with this Type 21, the Type 7s and the Type 9s were completely obsolete by that stage. Not necessarily technologically, but in terms of the battle, they could not live in the Atlantic. So the Germans either gave up in the Atlantic or they took a punt on the Type 21. So it depends on circumstances. They couldn't continue to produce they did keep building Type 7s and Type 9s, but they couldn't use them. They were unable to survive in the Atlantic at all. They were just targets by that stage. So they had to punt on the Type 21, but it was too late. With Germany being bombed continuously, they couldn't really produce it. They would never be able to iron out the problems. They would never be able to get them operational because they couldn't do it in the circumstances that they were unfortunately in for them. I mean, it's a good thing really, but yeah, they had to punt on them. Whereas, as I say, with things like the Sherman tank, the Americans didn't have to punt on it. They just said, we'll just keep building them.
Right. And just one more, with Donet's sort of, I guess, making claims to Hitler or however about the performance of these submarines, do you feel like that was him deliberately misrepresenting the situation, or is it just a case of the actual submarines as built were just not as well performing as the original projections, which is how it came across in your presentation? So it's not like he was necessarily misleading, but your thoughts?
No, I mean, theoretically, in terms of the design, they were good. I mean, it wasn't design problems so much that caused the problems. It was production difficulties and the normal things that we've experienced in ships. I mean, let's face it, the diesel engines on the Collins class never worked properly, did they? They were brand new design put into the Collins class, and they had problems with them. So we still have the problems today. So, I mean, he probably believed his technical experts, and theoretically the Type 21s could have delivered, but they were just never going to be got operational in the circumstances the Germans faced in the end of World War II.
Yeah, I think your comment, Tim, about who actually built them too, you mentioned slave labour, what the quality control might have been at the time. Maybe that was part of the problem.
I can certainly give you examples because I've also looked at the whole of the Battle of the Atlantic. Probably doesn't surprise you. There were U-boats there's one example of a U-boat going out on 3 successive patrols and having to return due to sabotage in the dockyard by non-German workers. So yes, they were probably never going to get it to work.
Now, Phil Helmore has a question. Phil's always reliable to ask a question.
Yeah, Tim, great presentation. Thanks very much. Really enjoyed it. You said that the Brits and the Americans both had Type 21 submarines. How did they get hold of them? Did they capture them live, did they?
Well, unlike a lot of Germans, Donitz was actually a pretty decent guy. And so he was in charge at the end of the war, and he ordered them all to surrender and made sure that they did. So in fact, the entire U-boat fleet did in fact surrender itself at the end of the war. So it wasn't, you might be familiar with the fact that at the end of the First World War, the High Seas Fleet scuttled itself in Scapa Flow. In this case, he ordered them to surrender. And so they had their pick of U-boats.
Oh, so you're saying that they ended up with them after the war. It wasn't during the war that
they
were able
to... No, they didn't get them during the war. No.
Okay, I understand. Okay, all right, thanks.
The Germans delivered them to the Allies. Yeah, not during the war. They didn't capture any during the war, no.
Right. Okay.
Do you have ideas of exactly how many were lost and how many existed at the end of the war, if only half a dozen or so ended up in Allied hands?
That's a good question. How many of the Type 21s were destroyed? I can't tell you that. I could look it up, but I can't tell you offhand how many were destroyed. I've told you instances of a few being destroyed. There were things like, there's one in existence still in Germany, the Wilhelm Bauer, which is a Type 21. It was underwater for 10 years after World War II, after being scuttled, raised by the German Navy, refurbished, and then used by them for 12 years. So there were a bunch scuttled and lost and that sort of stuff. And there were quite a few destroyed just in the shipyard before they were complete, or after they were complete. But I couldn't tell you exactly how many, but quite a number destroyed.
I note that Ewan's got an active mic. Did you have a question, Ewan?
It's a bit unfair to criticise the Hedemoras. The early problems were due to the weight issue in the columns, where they set about stripping weight out of the engines, and that caused problems. And when that was rectified, the problems were with the fuel system supply. The system of tanks and their water separator that didn't work, rather than the diesel engines themselves.
There you go, teething problems, which is a good comment, because I mean the Type 21s were teething problems in a lot of cases, which if they had the time and the opportunity, they probably could have solved some of them, but because they didn't and they couldn't have, because they were working under rather adverse circumstances.
I note Martin Reynoldson raising his hand again, old school.
And actually, I was just going to make that same comment that Tim just made. Almost all the things that you talked about, Tim, that reduced the performance from the original promised performance weren't fundamental flaws. They were all what you'd call teething problems. So if there had been another year on the war and the Germans weren't being bombed at that moment in time, then probably the Type 21 would have actually ended up being a very good submarine.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, let's face it. As I said, it's the grandfather of the Collins class, and it was the father of the entire generation of conventional submarines that appeared in the 50s. Oberon's.
But what about the Type? You touched on the Type 23, which of course was also battery powered, heavily battery powered coastal boat.
Yes.
Do you know how many of them were around and whether they sunk anything?
Certainly 3 of those went operational and did cruises off the coast of the United Kingdom. Can't recall whether they sank anything, but certainly 3 of those went operational and cruised around a bit. Yeah.
Was that going
And
to be
is
your
as
next,
much
your next
known
lecture?
about them as the others?
Not as much information is out there about the Type 23, and I've got to be honest, I didn't look them up because I got involved in this one. So I haven't looked into the Type 23. I know what they look like and their basic performance, but I haven't done an investigation of the Type 23. Martin's
Oh,
going
still
to
got-
He's got a
That's what
picture,
it
he's got a
looks
model
like.
of one
That's a
there.
Type
Actually.
23.
Yep. They're not very big. I mean, I think it's something
It's a
like
different scale from the other models that I showed. This is a 144 scale.
it's something
that's
like I
Type
think only 215 tons and 2 torpedo tubes, something like that.
So we've still got 38 people in the meeting, which is fantastic. We've lost a few as we went past 7:30. Anyone else got any questions? I don't see
Warren,
anyone
John
else.
Jeremy here.
Yes, John. Excellent.
Look, Tim, thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation enormously. It's a fascinating subject. I wanted to sort of add a little bit of a comment, if I may. A previous managing director of Vickers Australia was Peter Scott Maxwell, a submariner during the war with a remarkable story. But at the end of the war, Peter was sent to Germany to recover and help recover 1 or 2 of the hydrogen peroxide powered submarines. In fact, was involved in bringing back the U-boat, which subsequently became HMS Meteorite. And Peter stayed in Germany gathering up unfinished turbine machinery for those submarines to send back to Vickers at Barrow to use in Meteorite and to learn something about these submarines. Peter's comment about the quality of the German submarines was always very interesting. He said that they were being built with such a rush at that time with the shortage of materials, with valves often made of steel rather than the more proper materials. But this was accepted because the anticipated life of a German U-boat at that stage of the war was in a matter of weeks, and that the quality was such that the submarines were downright dangerous, in his opinion. A very interesting, pity he's not around today to comment on your talk, because I'm sure he would have been able to add some very interesting aspects of the German submarine construction at that time.
Yes.
Thanks, John. There's a few more questions and comments that have popped into the chat. There's another one from Carl Lindenbach. Were the Germans experimenting with any advanced propeller designs in World War II to reduce noise and cavitations, and perhaps was this explored in the Type 21? Do we know anything about propeller design developments?
Haven't heard anything. I didn't come across anything. As I say, they were only just getting into noise at the end of the war, because, as I say, up until really the whole of World War II was all as active pinging, finding you didn't listen for anything. So I don't think they were putting any effort into that, because it wasn't any great threat. Now, obviously, had the war gone on, as I say, the British were already looking into finding and destroying Type 21s by listening for them, using passive sonar, as we now call it. But it was only very much in its infancy at that stage. And I certainly didn't come across anything where they attempted to, where they were paying any attention to trying to make them particularly quiet.
Thanks for that. Gagan Dillon is contributing also to the comments, answering my earlier question, how many were destroyed. He says from a resource on YouTube, another documentary, 84 boats were completed and 21 were destroyed after Germany's surrender. But we have Martin Grimm raising another question, pointy bow versus teardrop. Martin, would you like to speak to your question, or?
Sorry, too many things. Yeah, you pretty well asked it, Warren. I guess on the arrangement drawings and even the model, etc., you can see it's the sort of classic sort of World War I, World War II submarine shape where you still sort of got a stem at the bow, whereas later submarines tended to have a teardrop shaped bow if they're trying to optimise for resistance. So any thoughts on that, Tim, as to why the Germans were still going down the pointy bow route?
I must admit I haven't come across anything that even discussed it, but I would assume that they took the simplest approach, which was to basically just streamline their standard U-boat design.
Sure.
Which was
the
easy thing to do. I don't know whether they even contemplated changing the basic design. I'm not sure.
I guess it opens up the question to our hydrodynamicists, and Martin Reynoldson is keen to have a word.
Yeah, no, I replied to Martin Grimm on the chat thing. I think even the first nuclear-powered submarine had a fairly pointy bow. It didn't occur to people back then to not do it that way, and so the Albacore.
Nautilus looked exactly like that, basically. Yeah,
it had a fairly pointy bow, not quite as pointy, but basically it was a point. So really, the Albacore, which the Americans developed, that was the first time people started thinking about not designing a submarine to be on the surface, because it's a disaster on the surface to have the Albacore type bow.
Yes.
Got it. So it might still be very much a surface ship thinking and mentality. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, looking back on it, it's obvious, but at the time, I don't think they thought it. You know, it's a big change in one's thinking.
Yeah, that paradigm shift.
I mean, the first American class of conventional submarines designed to build after the war, which was the Tang class, which was about 1950, I think, they looked like the Type 21. They didn't have the teardrop hull. It's just what you did, I guess, until clever naval architects turned up.
Yeah, it's that paradigm.
Sorry, Warren, I might just add, of course, there's a nice upper part of the Oberon submarines and the tail end down at Holbrook. And, you know, if you're ever travelling through that way, definitely stop in on it. You know, my feeling is it's, you know, the appendages on the Oberons, even though it's a far more modern submarine, there's still a lot of drag in them. And you know, there's a lot of improvements that could have been made even to an Oberon design in terms of trying to reduce appendage drag, for instance. So, yeah, worth a look over these days if you're ever heading through.
Question I was going to raise at the beginning, I guess, is what prompted you to delve into the 21 in particular, but I know you're fascinated by history in general, so you probably delved into a lot of issues with the same depth and enthusiasm. So would you like to make any final comments, Tim?
Well, I must admit, I between 2014 and 2018, I actually dived into the Battle of the Atlantic in great detail. And in fact, I've given 10 two-hour presentations on the Battle of the Atlantic. And I delved into it in excruciating detail. I decided that I would try and become the world's authority on the Battle of the Atlantic, and I don't know whether I've achieved it or not. And of course, the Type 21 appeared in that. And I have to confess, I've also written a paper that's titled Ultra and the Battle of the Atlantic, the True Story, which I don't think is appropriate for Ryder, but I delved into Ultra, which you're all aware with the decryption of German Enigma messages. And I decided I would sort that out as well, because there's a hell of a lot of mythology out there about that as well. So I've written a paper which I hope to publish at some stage.
Yeah, well, we could have Tim's Mythbusters, you know, as a series.
I I do like busting myths. There were a hell of a lot of myths about Ultra. The big one being, of course, that it won the Battle of the Atlantic, which it didn't. It wasn't even a significant factor in the Battle of the Atlantic, as it turned out. But a lot of people do believe that it won the Battle of the Atlantic.
Well, fantastic. Well, I think, yeah, there's opportunities for other presentations, and
Yes.
Based on tonight, we'd be happy to host you anytime you've got a presentation to give to this community. So once again, thanks very much, Tim. Really appreciated. Thank you, Lily. Thank you for all those that have attended and made this such a great evening.